I took the night shift at Graymore Psychiatric Residence because nobody else would take it, and because I needed the money badly enough to ignore the reasons nobody else would take it. The facility sat on 11 acres of overgrown land at the end of a gravel road outside of Harwell, West Virginia, a town so small that the post office and the gas station shared a parking lot, and the nearest hospital was 45 minutes away on roads that turned to mud when it rained. Graymore had been built in the 1920s as a tuberculosis sanatorium, converted to a state mental health facility in the 60s, partially closed in the 90s during budget cuts, and then reopened 5 years ago as a privately funded long-term residential care center for patients with severe psychiatric conditions who had exhausted every other placement option. It was the last stop, the place where families sent the people they could no longer keep, and the state sent the people it could no longer house, and the building itself seemed to understand its purpose because it wore its age and decay like a uniform. The walls were institutional green, the linoleum was cracked and buckled in the hallways, the fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency that burrowed into your skull after the first hour and lived there permanently, and the heating system produced a sound that was somewhere between a groan and a scream every 40 minutes, with such mechanical regularity that you could set your watch by it. I was 26 years old, and I had just finished my licensed practical nurse certification after 2 years of night classes and clinical rotations that left me so exhausted I once fell asleep standing up in a hospital elevator. My wife Clara was 7 months pregnant with our first child, and we were living in a 2-bedroom rental with a leaking roof and a landlord who responded to maintenance requests with the enthusiasm of a man being asked to donate a kidney. I needed steady work with benefits, and Graymore was offering both, plus a shift differential for overnights that pushed the hourly rate into territory I could not afford to refuse. The overnight shift ran from 11 at night to 7 in the morning, and for the first 3 weeks, it was exactly what I expected, which is to say it was boring in the specific and oppressive way that only institutional night work can be boring. The facility housed 32 residents across 2 wings, east and west, connected by a central corridor that passed through the nursing station, the medication room, and a small break area with a microwave that smelled permanently of burnt popcorn. East Wing held the higher functioning residents, people who could feed themselves and maintain basic hygiene and hold fragmented conversations about topics that drifted in and out of coherence like radio stations on a long drive. West Wing was different. West Wing held the residents who required constant monitoring, the ones whose conditions had progressed beyond the reach of medication and therapy, into territories that the textbooks described with clinical detachment, but that the reality of close proximity revealed to be something far more unsettling. My responsibilities on the night shift were straightforward: conduct hourly rounds on both wings, checking each room through the observation window to confirm the resident was in bed and breathing, administer scheduled medications at midnight and 4 in the morning, document vitals for any resident flagged for monitoring, respond to call lights and alarms, and, in theory, contact the on-call physician if anything went sideways, though the on-call physician was a semi-retired internist named Dr. Falk, who lived 40 minutes away and answered his phone roughly half the time. For the first 3 weeks, nothing went sideways. The residents slept, or they did not sleep, and the ones who did not sleep sat in their beds and stared at the walls or murmured to themselves, or, in the case of a resident in East Wing named Harold, who had been at Graymore longer than any current staff member, sang hymns in a thin, wavering tenor that floated down the hallway like smoke. I adjusted to the rhythm. I learned which floorboards creaked and which doors stuck and which light switches controlled which fixtures, and I developed the particular heightened awareness that all night shift workers cultivate, the ability to distinguish between the normal sounds of an old building settling and the abnormal sounds that require investigation. By the end of my first month, I felt competent, if not comfortable, and I had begun to believe that the warnings I had received during my interview, vague references to the unique challenges of overnight staffing at this type of facility, delivered by the director of nursing, with the careful phrasing of someone selecting words from a legal template, were simply the standard disclaimers that every institution uses to manage expectations and limit liability. I believed that until I met the patient in room 14. Room 14 was in West Wing, at the far end of the corridor, the last door before the hallway terminated at a fire exit that opened onto a concrete stairwell leading to the basement. The room was identical to every other room in the facility, 8 by 10 feet with a reinforced window, a bolted bed frame, a built-in shelf, and a steel door with an observation port at eye level. The resident in room 14 was listed in the charts as Edwin Calloway, male, 67 years old, admitted 11 years prior with a diagnosis that read like a catalog of everything that can go wrong inside a human mind. His medication regimen was the most complex in the facility, a rotating architecture of antipsychotics and mood stabilizers and sedatives that required precise timing and careful documentation. During my first 3 weeks, Edwin had been asleep every time I checked his room. He slept on his back with his arms at his sides and his eyes closed, perfectly still, and through the observation port he looked less like a sleeping man and more like a photograph of one. I recorded his position and moved on and thought nothing of it. On the 23rd night, a Thursday, I was conducting my 1 o'clock round. I walked the East Wing first as usual, checked each room, documented each observation, and then crossed through the central corridor to West Wing. I moved down the hallway checking rooms, and when I reached room 14 and looked through the observation port, Edwin was not in his bed. The bed was empty. The sheets were pulled back neatly, folded at a precise angle, and the pillow bore the shallow impression of a head that was no longer there. I felt my stomach drop. A missing resident on the night shift is a code event, a lockdown protocol that involves waking the charge nurse, alerting security, and searching every room and corridor until the resident is located. I was reaching for my radio when I saw him. He was standing in the corner of the room, the far corner, the one that the observation port's angle made difficult to see without pressing your face flat against the glass. He was standing upright with his back against the wall and his arms at his sides, exactly the way he lay in bed, the same posture transposed vertically. His eyes were open. They were not wandering or unfocused the way I had seen in other residents during episodes of nighttime agitation. They were fixed. They were locked onto the observation port with a directness and an intensity that made me take a physical step backward from the door. He was looking at me, not in my general direction, at me, with the focused, unblinking precision of a man who had been waiting for me to arrive and had positioned himself specifically to be seen at the exact moment I looked through the glass. I stood in the hallway for a full 10 seconds, and in those 10 seconds Edwin did not move. He did not blink. He did not shift his weight or adjust his posture or give any indication whatsoever that he was a living organism and not a piece of furniture arranged against the wall. The only evidence of life was the faint, rhythmic movement of his chest, rising and falling with a mechanical regularity that matched the cadence of the heating system's groans, as though his breathing had synchronized with the building itself. I made a note in the chart: resident awake, standing, oriented to observer, no distress noted, and I moved on. I told myself it was nothing. Psychiatric residents get out of bed at night. They stand in corners. They stare at things. This is documented behavior, expected behavior, behavior that falls well within the parameters of the conditions that brought them to a facility like Graymore in the first place. I told myself this, and I believed it for approximately 24 hours, until my next shift, when I conducted my 1 o'clock round and looked through the observation port of room 14 and found Edwin standing in the same corner, in the same posture, with his eyes fixed on the glass, waiting for me. This happened every night for the next 2 weeks, every single night. 1 o'clock round, room 14. Edwin, standing in the corner, eyes on the port, motionless as stone. He was never standing during the midnight round or the 2 o'clock round or the 3 o'clock round, only at 1. Only when I arrived at his door at the exact time I always arrived at his door, a time that varied by no more than 3 minutes in either direction because the rounds followed a fixed route and my pace was consistent. He had learned my schedule. He knew when I was coming, and he positioned himself every night to be standing in that corner at the precise moment my face appeared in the window. I brought this up with the day shift charge nurse, a veteran named Patrice, who had worked at Graymore since its reopening, and who carried herself with the weary authority of someone who had seen everything and been impressed by nothing. She listened to my account, nodded, and said, "Edwin does things like that. He fixates. Last year, he memorized the cleaning crew's schedule and would move his furniture to block the door at the exact time they arrived. The year before that, he figured out which nurse administered his 4 o'clock meds and would write her name on the wall in toothpaste every night before she came. It is pattern recognition. His brain is broken in a lot of ways, but the part that identifies and predicts routines is operating at a very high level. Do not let it bother you. I tried not to let it bother me. I tried for 3 more nights, and on the 3rd night something changed. I reached room 14 at 103, looked through the port, and Edwin was in his corner. But this time he was not simply staring. His lips were moving. He was speaking, silently, forming words with exaggerated precision, the way a person mouths words through a window when they want to be understood without being heard. I pressed closer to the glass. I am not a lip reader, not in any trained or certified capacity. But the words he was forming were short and simple, and he was repeating them with such deliberate clarity that I understood them on the 3rd repetition. He was saying, "I can hear her." I stepped back from the door. My skin was crawling, a phrase I had always considered metaphorical until that moment when I felt the actual physical sensation of my skin trying to detach itself from my muscles and relocate to a different body. I can hear her. I wrote it in the chart, and I moved on, and I spent the rest of the night in the nursing station with every light on and the radio playing softly because the silence had become something I could no longer tolerate. The next night, Edwin was in his corner again, lips moving, same words. I can hear her. And then, as I watched, his lips formed something new, something that required more syllables and more precision, and I leaned in until my nose was almost touching the cold glass of the observation port, and I read the words as he shaped them. "She is in the wall." I pulled back so fast that I stumbled over my own feet and caught myself against the opposite wall of the corridor. My flashlight clattered to the floor and rolled in a half circle, its beam sweeping across the baseboards like a searchlight. I picked it up with a hand that was no longer steady, and I walked, did not run, back to the nursing station. I sat in the chair, and I stared at the medication log, and I did not move for 45 minutes. I can hear her. She is in the wall. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to file it under the broad and forgiving category of things that psychiatric patients say, and move on with my shift and my career and my life. But I could not, because of something I had not told Patrice, something I had not told anyone, something I had been noticing for the past week and attributing to the natural behavior of an old building in the mountains of West Virginia, the sounds. They started around 1:30 every night, roughly half an hour after my interaction with Edwin, and they came from the walls of West Wing. Not the groaning of the heating system, which I had long since memorized, and which followed a pattern as predictable as a metronome. These sounds were different. They were irregular. They were faint, barely audible above the ambient hum of the building, and they seemed to migrate, appearing first near room 14, and then moving down the corridor toward the central hub, traveling behind the drywall like something threading its way through the spaces between the studs. The sound was a scratching, rhythmic but not mechanical, organic, the sound of something with nails or claws or fingertips dragging slowly along the inside of a wall, pausing, and then dragging again. I told myself it was mice, West Virginia, old building, rural setting. Mice were not only possible, they were inevitable. I told myself this every night for a week, and every night the scratching came at the same time and followed the same path, from room 14 to the nursing station, and every night it lasted exactly 17 minutes before it stopped, not fading gradually but ceasing abruptly, as though whatever was producing it had reached its destination and had no further need to move. On a Wednesday night in late October, I decided to investigate. I told myself it was professional responsibility. The facility had a pest control contract, and if there was a rodent infestation in the walls, it needed to be documented and reported. I brought a flashlight and a stethoscope, and at 1:30, when the scratching began, I pressed the stethoscope against the wall outside room 14 and listened. The sound was immediately louder, amplified by the instrument into something that filled my ears and my skull and made the hair on my arms stand at attention. It was not mice. Mice skitter. Mice scramble. Mice produce a chaotic, rapid, uneven sound that reflects the frenetic energy of a small creature moving through a small space. This was deliberate. This was measured. This was the sound of something moving with intention, something that knew where it was going and was in no hurry to get there. I followed the sound down the corridor, pressing the stethoscope against the wall every 10 feet, tracking its progress. It moved at a walking pace, roughly 2 miles per hour, maintaining a consistent speed that matched the rhythm of human footsteps. It passed room 13, room 12, room 11, each time growing neither louder nor softer, but maintaining the same steady volume, the same measured cadence, as though the thing inside the wall was keeping pace with me on the other side. I stopped at room 9. The scratching stopped at room 9. I stood in the corridor with the stethoscope pressed against the green paint, and I listened to the silence that replaced the sound, a silence that felt heavier and more oppressive than the scratching itself, a silence that carried the quality of breath being held. And then, from the other side of the wall, from inside the wall, from a space that should have contained nothing but insulation and wiring and the skeletal framework of a building that had stood for a century, I heard a sound that will live inside me until I die. It was a voice, a human voice. Female, whispering. The words were not English. They were not any language I recognized. They were syllables arranged in patterns that followed no grammar I had ever encountered, rising and falling in a cadence that was almost musical, almost liturgical, like a prayer being recited in a tongue that had been dead for centuries. The whisper lasted 4 seconds. Then it stopped. And then, from the other side of the wall, something knocked. 3 times. Slow, deliberate, spaced exactly 2 seconds apart. Knock, knock, knock. I ripped the stethoscope from my ears and I backed away from the wall, and I did not stop backing away until I hit the opposite wall of the corridor and stood there with my shoulders pressed against the plaster and my heart hammering so hard that I could feel it in my teeth. I looked at the wall I had just been listening to. It was a wall. Green paint, white baseboards, a scuff mark near the floor where a gurney had bumped it at some point in the past. It was the most ordinary wall in the most ordinary corridor of the most ordinary institutional building I had ever seen, and I had just heard a woman whispering inside of it. I did not finish my rounds that night. I went back to the nursing station, and I sat there until 7 in the morning, and when the day shift arrived, I handed over the keys and the medication log, and I drove home, and I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside because I needed to compose my face into something that would not frighten my pregnant wife. The next day, I called the facility director, a businessman named Kimball who owned 3 other care facilities in the region, and visited Graymore approximately once per quarter. I told him about the sounds. I told him about the scratching and the migration pattern and the voice and the knocking. I did not tell him about Edwin because I was not yet ready to connect those 2 threads, and because connecting them led to conclusions that I was not prepared to reach. Kimball listened with the polite disinterest of a man being told about a colleague's dream, and then said, "Old building, Marcus. You would not believe the sounds these places make when the temperature drops. I will have the maintenance contractor check the ductwork next time he is out there." The maintenance contractor did not come that week or the following week or any week after that. I began to research the building's history, not because I believed in ghosts. I want to be absolutely clear about that. I did not then, and I do not now believe in ghosts, but because I believed that something was producing those sounds, and that the explanation, whatever it was, might be found in the structural or historical record of a building that had served 3 distinct institutional purposes over the course of 100 years. I drove to the county records office on my day off and spent 4 hours in a basement archive room pulling permits, inspection reports, and incident files. Graymore had been built in 1923. The original blueprints showed a straightforward layout, two residential wings connected by a central administrative section with a full basement that housed the boiler, the laundry, and the morgue. The morgue. I had not known about the morgue. In the tuberculosis era, patients died frequently enough that the facility required on-site cold storage. The morgue was directly beneath West Wing, accessible through the basement stairwell at the end of the corridor. The same stairwell that was on the other side of the fire exit door adjacent to room 14. I continued reading. In 1967, when the building was converted to a psychiatric facility, the morgue was decommissioned and sealed. The county inspection report from that year noted that the basement level beneath West Wing had been closed to access and filled with structural concrete at all entry points per state directive. The space had been entombed. Whatever was down there, the examination tables, the storage drawers, the drainage channels in the floor, had been buried under tons of concrete and forgotten. But here is the thing about buildings, and here is the thing that kept me awake for the next 3 nights. Buildings are not solid objects. They are frameworks. They are lattices of wood and steel and empty space, and the empty spaces connect to each other through channels and gaps and accidental voids that no blueprint fully documents. The wall cavities in West Wing ran from the first floor to the basement. The concrete that sealed the morgue had sealed the doors and the stairwell access, but it had not sealed the spaces inside the walls. Whatever was beneath West Wing was separated from the occupied rooms above it by nothing more than a floor, a layer of insulation, and the hollow channels between the studs. On my next shift, a Friday night, I made a decision. At 1:15, after Edwin had performed his nightly vigil in the corner of room 14 and mouthed his words at me through the glass, I walked to the fire exit door at the end of the West Wing corridor. I had never opened this door. The staff orientation materials described it as an emergency exit only, alarmed, leading to a basement stairwell that terminated at a sealed concrete wall. I pushed the bar. The alarm did not sound. The wiring had been disconnected at some point in the past, possibly years ago, and no one had noticed or cared. The door opened onto a concrete stairwell lit by a single bare bulb that cast a yellow light over walls streaked with moisture stains and mineral deposits. The air was cold and wet, the kind of cold that comes from underground spaces that never see sunlight, and it carried a smell that I recognized from my clinical rotations, the sweet, cloying, unmistakable smell of biological decay. I descended the stairs, 12 steps. At the bottom was a short corridor, perhaps 15 feet long, with concrete walls and a concrete floor and a single door at the far end. The door was steel, painted gray, and it was open, not ajar. Open, fully open, swung back against the wall, its handle hanging loose as though the latch mechanism had been removed. Beyond the door was darkness, and from the darkness came the scratching sound, louder now, more immediate, stripped of the muffling effect of walls and floors, raw and close and real. I shone my flashlight through the doorway. The beam cut through the dark and illuminated a room that should not have existed. The county record said this space was filled with concrete. It was not. The room was roughly 20 feet square, with bare concrete walls and a floor that was cracked and uneven and stained with patterns that I did not want to identify. In the center of the room was a metal table, old, rusted, bolted to the floor, the kind of table that appears in autopsy photographs from the early 20th century. And on the walls, covering every inch of every surface from floor to ceiling, were scratches, thousands of them, tens of thousands. Not random marks, but organized patterns, rows and columns and spirals and grids, etched into the concrete with something sharp, something that had been dragged across the surface with enough force to carve grooves a quarter-inch deep. Some of the marks were old, filled with mineral deposits and worn smooth by time. Some of them were fresh. I moved the flashlight beam slowly across the walls, and as the light traveled, I began to see that the marks were not abstract. They were tallies. They were counting something. Days, perhaps. Hours. Iterations of something that repeated often enough to require a record. I followed the tallies around the room, thousands upon thousands of them, and when the beam reached the far corner, it illuminated something that made me drop the flashlight. There was a person in the corner, not standing the way Edwin stood, rigid and vertical and alert. This person was sitting on the floor with their knees drawn up and their arms wrapped around their shins and their head bowed so that their face was hidden. They were wearing a hospital gown, the kind that Graymore issued to its residents, white with blue stripes, and their feet were bare and black with grime. Their fingernails, the ones I could see wrapped around their shins, were long and broken and dark with something that might have been dirt and might have been dried blood. I scrambled for the flashlight. I picked it up and pointed it at the figure, and my voice came out as a croak that barely qualified as speech. "Hello? Can you hear me? Are you a resident?" The figure raised its head. It was a woman. She was old, far older than any current resident at Graymore, with white hair that hung in matted ropes over her face and skin that was the color and texture of old paper. Her eyes were open, and they were the palest blue I had ever seen. So pale, they were almost white, and they reflected the flashlight beam, the way an animal's eyes reflect headlights on a dark road, with a flat, luminous glow that contained no warmth and no recognition, and no indication whatsoever that the mind behind them was operating within the boundaries of what we consider human consciousness. She looked at me, and then she opened her mouth and began to whisper. And the sound that came out was the same sound I had heard through the stethoscope, the same cadence, the same alien syllables, the same rise and fall that mimicked prayer without achieving meaning. I backed toward the door. I did not turn around. I kept the flashlight on her, and I moved backward, step by step, until I felt the door frame against my shoulder blades, and then I turned and I ran. I ran up the stairs and through the fire exit and down the West Wing corridor, and I did not stop until I reached the nursing station, where I grabbed the phone and called 911 and told the dispatcher that there was an unidentified person in the basement of a psychiatric facility and that I needed police and paramedics immediately. They arrived in 22 minutes. I led them to the stairwell and we descended together, 4 officers and 2 paramedics and me. And when we reached the bottom of the stairs and turned our lights toward the open door of the room that should have been filled with concrete, the woman was gone. The room was empty. The table was there. The scratches were there. The stains on the floor were there. But the woman was gone. The officers searched the basement, which extended farther than the blueprints suggested, branching into subsidiary corridors and storage alcoves that had been omitted from every record I had found at the county office. They found evidence of habitation, empty cans of food, plastic water bottles, piles of fabric that might once have been blankets, and in one alcove a collection of objects that the lead officer photographed but would not let me see, saying only that they appeared to be personal effects of indeterminate age. They did not find the woman. The investigation that followed consumed the next several weeks and produced more questions than answers. The county determined that the concrete seal installed in 1967 had been partial, closing the main stairwell access but leaving subsidiary passages intact. Someone, at some point in the intervening decades, had breached one of the remaining access points from the outside, creating an entrance to the basement that bypassed the facility entirely. The food containers found in the subsidiary corridors bore expiration dates spanning a range of 6 years. Someone had been living in the basement of Graymore for at least 6 years, moving through the wall cavities at night, occupying a space that the official records declared did not exist. Edwin Calloway, when questioned by the clinical staff, produced a response that was recorded in his chart verbatim. "She has been here longer than me. She walks at night. She counts the days on the walls. She is waiting for someone, but I do not think the person she is waiting for is alive anymore." The facility was closed for 3 months during the investigation. The basement was excavated and properly sealed. The wall cavities were inspected and filled with expanding foam. The fire exit door was repaired and alarmed. Graymore reopened in February, and I was offered my position back with a raise and an apology from Kimball that was so carefully worded it had clearly been drafted by an attorney. I declined. I took a job at a hospital in Charleston, day shift, with windows and sunlight and corridors that did not groan, and walls that contained nothing but wiring and insulation. Clara and I had our daughter in March, and I held her in the delivery room and looked at her face and felt a joy so pure and overwhelming that it temporarily displaced the memory of a pale-eyed woman sitting in the dark beneath a building full of sleeping people, whispering words in a language that no one alive could understand, counting the days on concrete walls with broken fingernails, while the world above her went about its business, utterly unaware that she was there. I still think about Edwin, standing in his corner every night at 1 o'clock, his lips moving silently behind the glass. I can hear her. She is in the wall. He was not delusional. He was not hallucinating. He was the only person in that building who was paying attention, and the thing he was paying attention to was real. The thing I cannot stop thinking about, the thing that surfaces at 3 in the morning when the house is quiet and Clara is breathing softly beside me and the baby is asleep in her crib, is this. The food containers in the basement spanned 6 years. The county sealed the morgue in 1967. That is a gap of more than 50 years. The containers accounted for 6 of them. What happened during the other 44? And the scratches on the walls, the ones that were old and worn and filled with mineral deposits, the ones that had clearly been there for decades. Who made those? The police never identified the woman. They never found her. They checked every missing persons database in the state and the surrounding states and produced nothing. Whoever she was, wherever she came from, she walked out of that basement through a passage that the police never located, and she disappeared into the mountains of West Virginia. And for all I know, she is still out there, still counting, still whispering, still waiting for someone who will never come. I want to start by saying that I consider myself a rational person. I have a degree in biology. I believe in evidence and documentation and the scientific method, and I do not scare easily. I grew up in a house with 3 older brothers who thought it was hilarious to jump out of closets and hide under beds, and I developed, by necessity, a tolerance for surprise and a deep skepticism of anything that could not be explained by observable physical phenomena. I say this so you understand that what I am about to tell you was not the product of an overactive imagination or a nervous disposition. I was not prone to paranoia before I moved into the Bellamy Apartments. I am prone to it now. I moved into the Bellamy Apartments on the first day of September because the rent was $400 below market rate, and I was in no position to ask why. I was 29 years old, recently divorced, carrying the financial wreckage of a marriage that had ended with the subtlety of a car crash, and working as a veterinary technician at an animal hospital that paid me just enough to survive, but not enough to survive comfortably. The Bellamy was a 5-story brick building on the east side of Portland, Oregon, wedged between a laundromat and a Vietnamese restaurant, and presided over by a landlord named Oleg, who communicated exclusively through handwritten notes slipped under doors, and who maintained the building with the enthusiasm of a man watering a plant he hoped would die. The elevator had not worked since the previous administration. The hallway carpets bore stains that predated my birth. The lobby smelled like boiled cabbage and industrial cleaner in alternating waves depending on which direction the ventilation system decided to push the air on any given day. My apartment was on the 4th floor, Unit 4B, a 1-bedroom with a kitchen that was technically a corner of the living room and a bathroom whose shower produced water at 2 temperatures, scalding and absent. But it had a window that faced west, and in the evenings the sunset poured through the glass and painted the walls in shades of amber and rose, and for 20 minutes each day the apartment was beautiful, and those 20 minutes were enough to justify everything else. I met my neighbor on the 2nd day. I was carrying a box of books up the stairs because the elevator was, as previously noted, a decorative monument to mechanical failure, and I paused on the 4th floor landing to shift the weight and catch my breath. The door to 4C, the apartment directly adjacent to mine, was open approximately 3 inches, and through the gap I could see a narrow slice of the interior, a wall covered in dark fabric, a floor lamp with no shade casting a harsh white circle on the ceiling, and the edge of a table piled with something I could not identify from that angle. I would not have given it a second thought except that, as I stood there adjusting the box in my arms, an eye appeared in the gap. A single human eye, positioned at a height that suggested its owner was either very tall or standing on something, brown and unblinking and fixed on me with an intensity that was so absolute and so devoid of self-consciousness that it felt less like being watched and more like being scanned. I nearly dropped the box. I said hi in the reflexive, slightly too loud voice that people use when they are startled and trying to pretend they're not. And the eye withdrew, and the door closed with a soft click. And I stood on the landing for a moment, and then carried my books into my apartment and locked the door and did not think about it again until that night when I heard the sound for the first time. It was approximately 2 in the morning. I was lying in bed in the particular state of exhausted wakefulness that defined my nights during that period, too tired to function and too anxious to sleep, running calculations about alimony and car payments and whether I could afford both groceries and gas in the same week. The apartment was dark and quiet except for the ambient sounds of an old building at night, the ticking of cooling pipes, the distant murmur of traffic, the occasional creak of the floor above me. And then I heard it. A low, continuous, rhythmic tapping coming from the wall that my apartment shared with 4C. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. It was not the erratic sound of a pipe settling or a radiator cycling. It was deliberate. It was patterned. It was the sound of a human hand or a human knuckle striking a wall with the measured repetition of someone sending a message. It lasted approximately 5 minutes, and then it stopped, and I lay in the dark and listened to the silence that followed and told myself it was nothing and almost believed it. The tapping came back the next night. Same time, same rhythm, same wall, and the next night, and the next. Always at 2 in the morning, always lasting between 4 and 7 minutes, always stopping as abruptly as it started, as though the person producing it had completed a task and had no further reason to continue. On the 5th night, I got out of bed and pressed my ear against the wall and listened. The tapping was louder from this position, obviously, but I heard something else beneath it, something I had not detected from across the room. Breathing. Slow, deep, controlled breathing, audible through the wall, the way you can hear someone breathing when you stand outside a closed door and press your ear to the wood. Someone was standing on the other side of the wall, inches from me, tapping and breathing at 2 in the morning, and they had been doing this every night since I moved in. I knocked on the door of 4C the next afternoon. I knocked 4 times over the course of an hour and received no response. The door remained closed. No sound came from inside. I slipped a note under the door, a polite, carefully worded request to reduce nighttime noise, using the language of someone who has read enough online advice columns about neighbor disputes to know that the first communication should be friendly and non-confrontational. The note was gone the next morning, presumably retrieved from the other side, but the tapping continued that night without interruption or alteration. I tried to learn more about my neighbor. I asked other tenants. The woman in 4A, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Chen, who had lived in the building for 12 years, told me that the tenant in 4C was a man named Caleb, that he had moved in approximately 18 months ago, that she had seen him perhaps 4 times in that entire period, and that he received an unusual volume of packages, sometimes 3 or 4 per day, delivered by various carriers and always collected from the lobby within minutes of arrival, as though he were watching for them. The man in 3B, a bartender named Luis, who worked nights and slept days, told me he had once encountered Caleb in the stairwell at 3 in the morning, and that Caleb had been carrying a large plastic bin up the stairs and had pressed himself flat against the wall to let Luis pass without making eye contact or acknowledging his existence. "Dude gave me the creeps," Luis said, and then added with the philosophical shrug of someone who has lived in enough apartment buildings to calibrate his tolerance for eccentric neighbors. "But Portland, you know. I considered going to Oleg. I considered calling the police. I considered both options and rejected them because what would I say? My neighbor taps on the wall at night. That is not a crime. That is barely an inconvenience. That is the kind of complaint that makes a landlord roll his eyes and a police officer suppress a sigh, and both of them categorize you as the kind of tenant they wish would move somewhere else. So I adjusted. Humans adjust. That is what we do. It is our greatest talent and our most dangerous one, because adjustment is the mechanism by which we normalize things that should never become normal. The tapping became part of the background noise of my life, filed alongside the broken elevator and the bipolar shower and the cabbage smell and all the other minor indignities that composed the texture of my daily existence. I trained myself to sleep through it the way you train yourself to sleep through a clock ticking, or a refrigerator humming, or a partner snoring beside you. I bought earplugs. I adjusted my sleep schedule. I stopped pressing my ear against the wall, because the breathing on the other side had begun to feel less like a neighbor's quirk and more like an intimacy I had not consented to. And then, on a Saturday in late October, I came home from a 12-hour shift at the animal hospital and found my apartment door unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I locked my door every time I left, a habit so deeply ingrained that it had become automatic, a motor reflex rather than a conscious decision. I stood in the hallway with my keys in my hand and my stomach in my throat, and I pushed the door open slowly and looked inside. Everything was where I had left it. The dishes were in the sink. The throw blanket was on the couch. The stack of mail was on the kitchen counter. Nothing was missing. Nothing was moved. Nothing was disturbed, except for one thing. On my nightstand, beside the lamp and the alarm clock and the glass of water I always kept there, was a photograph, a Polaroid, the old-fashioned kind with the white border at the bottom. It was a photograph of me. I was asleep. I was lying in my bed, in my apartment, in the exact position I slept in every night, on my left side with my right arm curled under the pillow. The photograph had been taken from the doorway of my bedroom. The angle was clear. The lighting was the pale blue glow of my digital alarm clock, which meant the photograph had been taken at night, in the dark, while I was asleep, by someone standing in my bedroom doorway. I did not scream. I want you to understand that, because people always ask why I did not scream, as though screaming were a rational response to a photograph of yourself sleeping that you did not take and did not consent to and did not know existed until this exact moment. I did not scream because my body had entered a state that I later learned is called tonic immobility, the freeze response, the evolutionary holdover from a time when our ancestors survived predators not by fighting or fleeing, but by going absolutely still and hoping the predator would lose interest. I stood in my bedroom holding that photograph, and I was frozen, every muscle locked, my breathing shallow, my vision tunneled down to a narrow circle that contained only the image in my hands and nothing else. I did not call the police immediately, which in retrospect seems insane, but which in the moment made a kind of terrible sense because my brain was processing the information in layers, like a computer loading a complex program, one module at a time, and the first module was not fear, but disbelief. I picked up the photograph with hands that felt like they belonged to a mannequin, and I turned it over, and on the back, written in small, precise handwriting with black ink, were 6 words. You look peaceful when you sleep. I called the police. 2 officers arrived, examined the door, no signs of forced entry, took the photograph as evidence, and asked me if I had any idea who might have entered my apartment. I told them about Caleb. I told them about the tapping and the breathing and the eye in the doorway. They knocked on the door of 4C and received no answer. They told me to contact a locksmith to install a chain lock and a deadbolt and to call them immediately if anything else happened. They left. I called a locksmith. I installed a chain lock, a deadbolt, and a security bar on the inside of the door. I pushed my couch against the bedroom door. I did not sleep that night. I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the refrigerator and a chef's knife across my knees, and I watched the front door until the sun came up. The tapping came at 2 in the morning, same as always. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. I did not move. I sat on the kitchen floor, and I listened to the tapping and the breathing, and I gripped the handle of the knife, and I waited. When morning came, I went to Oleg's office in the basement and demanded to be let into 4C. I told him about the photograph. I told him about the break-in. I told him that his tenant was stalking me, and that if he did not open that door, I would call the police and the fire department and the local news and every other authority I could think of until someone did. Oleg looked at me with the exhausted resignation of a man who has been dealing with tenant disputes for 30 years and has long since accepted that his role in the cosmic order is to suffer. He produced a ring of keys, and we climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, and he knocked on the door of 4C and announced himself, and when no one answered, he inserted the key and opened the door. The smell hit us first. Not decay, not rot, not the biological stench of something dead or dying, but chemicals. The sharp, acrid, nostril-searing smell of developing fluid and fixative, the kind used in photographic darkrooms. The apartment was dark. Every window had been covered with black fabric, heavy and opaque, taped to the frames with precision. Oleg found the light switch and flipped it, and the fluorescent tube in the kitchen buzzed to life and illuminated a space that made both of us go very still. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them. I stopped counting at 300 because my vision was blurring and my knees were failing, and Oleg had placed his hand on my shoulder. Whether to steady me or steady himself, I could not tell. Polaroids and printed images, and what appeared to be screenshots from video feeds, all pinned or taped or glued to every available surface in a mosaic that covered the living room from floor to ceiling, with the meticulous, obsessive precision of a museum installation. They were arranged chronologically, I realized with a horror that tightened around my chest like a belt being cinched, starting from the upper left corner of the north wall and proceeding across and down in neat rows, each photograph dated in the same small, precise handwriting I had seen on the back of the Polaroid. The earliest date was 14 months prior, 2 months before I moved in. He had been photographing me for 2 months before I became his neighbor. He had found me somewhere else, at some prior location, at work, at the grocery store, on the street, and he had followed me and documented me and then engineered a way to live beside me. Every photograph was of me walking to my car, me entering the building, me at the grocery store, me at the animal hospital, visible through the front window, bending over an examination table, me sitting on my couch reading a book, photographed through my own window, from an angle that could only have been achieved from the fire escape outside 4C, me sleeping. Dozens of photographs of me sleeping, taken from different angles, on different nights, wearing different pajamas, in different positions. He had been inside my apartment multiple times, multiple, not once, not a single impulsive act. A sustained campaign of intrusion conducted over a period of weeks, carefully documented and meticulously archived. In the kitchen, on the table I had glimpsed through the crack in the door on my second day, was equipment, a camera, a laptop, a set of tools that included lockpicks and a bump key, and a small handheld device that Oleg later told the police was a signal jammer used to disable wireless security systems. And in the bathroom, which had been converted into a dark room with trays and chemical baths and a red safe light, the officers found a journal, Caleb's journal. It was a spiral-bound notebook, 200 pages, filled from cover to cover with small, dense handwriting. The police would not let me read it in its entirety, but the detective who handled my case, a woman named Vasquez who spoke with the controlled precision of someone who had trained herself to deliver terrible information calmly, told me that the journal contained detailed entries spanning the full 18 months of Caleb's tenancy. He had been watching me since before I moved in. He had not chosen 4C at random. He had chosen it specifically because it was adjacent to 4B, and he had chosen 4B for me by manipulating the rental listing. The police later determined that the below-market rate was not Oleg's doing. Caleb had hacked into the property listing website and altered the rent amount to ensure it would attract someone in a specific financial bracket, someone desperate enough to take an apartment without asking questions. He had selected me from a pool of applicants. He had researched my divorce, my finances, my work schedule, my habits. He had engineered the entire situation, the apartment, the price, the proximity, with the patience and precision of someone building a trap, one component at a time. The tapping on the wall was not random. According to the journal, it was a ritual. Caleb tapped the wall at 2 in the morning because that was the time, determined through weeks of observation, at which I was most deeply asleep. He tapped to confirm I was unconscious, listening for any change in my breathing pattern that would indicate I had woken. And when he was satisfied that I was truly asleep, he entered my apartment through the front door, using the bump key, and stood in my bedroom and watched me for intervals that the journal recorded in precise increments. 7 minutes, 12 minutes, 23 minutes, 41 minutes. The entries grew longer as the weeks progressed. On several occasions, he had sat on the floor beside my bed for over an hour. The journal's final entry, dated 2 days before the Polaroid appeared on my nightstand, read, "She is almost ready. The transition will be soon. I need to prepare the space." The police searched for Caleb for 3 weeks. They tracked his packages, which turned out to contain photographic supplies, surveillance equipment, and materials that the detective described to me as consistent with long-term confinement preparation and refused to elaborate on further. They traced his financial records to a series of prepaid accounts funded through cryptocurrency. They found no prior address, no employment history, no family contacts, no social connections of any kind. Caleb, like the apartment listing he had manipulated, was a constructed identity wrapped around a void. For 3 weeks I lived in a motel. I paid for it with a credit card I could not afford, and I chose a motel 40 miles from Portland in a town I had never visited because proximity to anything familiar had become intolerable. I changed my shifts at the animal hospital to randomized hours so that no pattern could be established. I drove a different route to work every day, adding 30 or 40 minutes to my commute by taking back roads and residential streets and doubling back on myself to check for following vehicles. I ate at different restaurants. I shopped at different stores. I did everything in my power to make myself unpredictable because unpredictability was the only defense I had against a person who had demonstrated the ability to study patterns and exploit them with surgical precision. They found him on November 9th. A patrol unit spotted him sitting in a parked car outside the animal hospital where I worked, watching the front window through a pair of binoculars. He did not resist arrest. He did not speak during the arrest. He did not speak during booking. He did not speak during his initial court appearance. His public defender entered a plea of not guilty, and Caleb sat in the courtroom with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance, and did not look at me once, which was somehow worse than if he had. He was convicted on charges of stalking, breaking and entering, and criminal surveillance. He received a sentence that his public defender appealed and that the appellate court upheld, and that I tracked through the state's online court record system with the obsessive regularity of a woman who understood that her survival depended on knowing exactly where this man was at every moment. I moved out of the Bellamy the day after Caleb's arrest. I moved out of Portland. I moved to a city I had never visited and rented an apartment on the 7th floor of a building with a doorman and a security system and cameras in every hallway, and I changed my locks every 3 months, and I installed motion sensors on every window, and I slept with the lights on for 2 years. And even now, more than 6 years later, in a different apartment in a different city, with a German shepherd named Bones, who sleeps at the foot of my bed and alerts to every sound with the vigilance of a creature who was bred for exactly this purpose, I still wake up at 2 in the morning, every night, 2 in the morning. And I lie in the dark, and I listen to the wall beside my bed, and I wait for the tapping that I know is not there but that my body refuses to stop expecting. And I do not fall back asleep until the silence is held for long enough to convince the animal part of my brain that I am alone. I am always alone. I made sure of that. I have not had a relationship since Caleb. I have not allowed another person to know my address, my schedule, my habits, the position I sleep in, the side of the bed I prefer, the exact minute at which my breathing shifts from the shallow rhythm of wakefulness to the deep, slow cadence of genuine sleep. Those are details now. Those are vulnerabilities. Those are the raw materials from which a person like Caleb constructs his architecture of obsession. The data points he catalogs in a spiral-bound notebook with small, precise handwriting. The inputs he feeds into whatever broken machinery operates inside his mind and converts into plans and timelines, and the phrase that still wakes me in the night, the transition will be soon. I do not know what the transition was. Detective Vasquez told me the journal's later entries described preparations that were consistent with long-term captivity scenarios, and that the space Caleb referred to preparing was a location the police never identified because Caleb refused to speak about it. Then or ever. He said nothing at his trial. He said nothing at his sentencing. He said nothing in the years since. He sits in a cell somewhere and he is silent, and his silence is its own kind of tapping. A rhythm I cannot hear but that I know is there, steady and patient and measured, counting the days until whatever mechanism governs his release determines that he has served enough time to be returned to the world. His release date is 4 years from now. I know this because I check the state's inmate database every single month, and I will continue checking it every single month until the number reaches 0, and then I will move again to another city in another state, and I will change my name and my appearance, and I will disappear, because disappearing is the only skill I have left that matters, and because I understand now, in a way that I wish I did not, that the difference between safety and danger is not a lock or a deadbolt or a German shepherd or a seventh-floor apartment with a doorman. It is the distance between you and the person who has decided that you belong to them. And that distance, no matter how large you make it, is never large enough, because people like Caleb do not measure distance the way the rest of us do. They measure it in patience, and patience is the one thing they have in unlimited supply. My name is Ray Dunlap, and I am a long-haul truck driver, or at least I was a long-haul truck driver before the events I am about to describe rearranged my understanding of the world and my place in it so thoroughly that the person who climbed into that cab on the night of March 14th and the person who climbed out of it 2 hours later were functionally different human beings sharing the same body. I have driven trucks for 22 years, and in that time I have logged enough miles to circumnavigate the earth 47 times, and I have seen things on American highways at 3 in the morning that would make a reasonable person reconsider ever leaving their house after dark. But nothing I have seen before or since compares to what happened on Interstate 80 in Nevada on the night of March 14th at mile marker 113. And I am telling you this story because I promised myself that if I ever stopped shaking long enough to form coherent sentences, I would put it down in words so that someone, anyone, would know what happened on that road and would understand why I no longer drive at night and why I will never, for as long as I draw breath on this earth, stop for a stranger on the shoulder of an empty highway. I was running a solo haul from Sacramento to Salt Lake City, a route I had driven so many times that my body knew the curves and the grades and the fuel stops the way a musician knows a piece of sheet music, by feel, by rhythm, by the kind of deep physical familiarity that bypasses conscious thought and operates entirely on reflex. I was driving a Kenworth T680, pulling a 53-foot dry van loaded with consumer electronics, 42,000 pounds of flat-screen televisions and wireless speakers and laptop computers destined for a distribution center in the Salt Lake Valley. The load was legal. The truck was in good mechanical condition. My logbook was clean, and I had slept a full 8 hours at the Flying J in Sacramento before departing at 9 in the evening. I was caffeinated and alert and making good time, and I was happy. As happy as a man can be who has spent 2 decades watching white lines disappear under his bumper in an unending stream of identical moments because the night was clear and the stars were out and the high desert of Nevada stretched in every direction like an ocean of black nothing, and I had the radio tuned to an AM station out of Reno that was playing classic country, and the heater was set to 72 degrees, and the cab smelled like the beef jerky I had been chewing since Fernley, and everything was right with the world. I had been driving for approximately 4 hours. The time was 1:15 in the morning. I was somewhere east of Lovelock, Nevada, on a stretch of I-80 that runs straight and flat through the Humboldt Sink, a region so empty and so featureless that the highway itself seems to exist in a vacuum. A ribbon of asphalt laid across a landscape that contains nothing. No buildings, no fences, no trees, no elevation changes, nothing but sagebrush and alkali flats extending to the horizon in every direction. The nearest town in either direction was at least 50 miles away. The nearest cell tower was 30. I had not seen another vehicle in either direction for 20 minutes, which was not unusual for this section of highway at this hour, but which contributed to the particular quality of isolation that defines night driving in the rural American West, the sense that you have been subtracted from the inhabited world and placed in a parallel version that contains only you and the road and the dark. I saw the car at mile marker 113. It was on the right shoulder, a sedan, dark-colored, impossible to determine the exact make and model at highway speed in the dark, with its hazard lights flashing in a weak, rhythmic pulse that suggested a battery running low. I would normally have called it in on the CB and kept driving, because stopping a fully loaded 18-wheeler on a dark highway shoulder to assist a stranded motorist is a complicated proposition involving braking distances and re-entry logistics and the very real risk of being rear-ended by a drowsy driver who does not see 80,000 pounds of stationary truck until it is too late. But I saw the figure standing beside the car, and I made a decision that I will regret for the remaining years of my life. It was a woman, or it appeared to be a woman. She was standing beside the driver's side door, with her arms wrapped around herself in the universal posture of cold and distress, and as my headlights swept across her, I saw her face, pale and wide-eyed, and contorted into an expression of such acute fear that my foot moved to the brake pedal before my conscious mind had finished processing what I was seeing. She waved, not the casual, half-hearted wave of someone who is inconvenienced and hoping for assistance, but the frantic, desperate, full-armed wave of someone who believes they are in danger and is begging for help. I downshifted. I applied the brakes. I pulled the Kenworth onto the shoulder 300 feet past her vehicle, which is standard procedure because you always want the stranded car behind you rather than in front of you so you can see it in your mirrors and you are not blind to approaching traffic. I set the parking brake and turned on my four ways and climbed down from the cab and walked back along the shoulder toward the woman and her car. The night was cold, mid-30s, and the wind was blowing from the northwest at maybe 15 miles per hour, enough to cut through my flannel jacket and make my eyes water. The stars were extraordinary, the dense, granular, impossible star field that you only see in places where the nearest artificial light is over the horizon, and they cast just enough ambient illumination to distinguish shapes from shadows without revealing details. The woman was standing where I had first seen her, beside her car, hugging herself. As I got closer, I could see that she was young, maybe mid-20s, wearing a thin jacket over what looked like a waitress uniform, the kind with the embroidered name tag and the polyester blend fabric that provides approximately zero insulation. Her hair was dark and pulled back, and her face was pale under the starlight, and she was shivering violently. Her car was a mid-2000s Honda Civic, dark blue or black, with a flat tire on the front passenger side. The tire was not just flat, it was shredded. The rubber peeled back from the rim in strips like the skin of a fruit, the kind of catastrophic blowout that happens when you drive on an underinflated tire for too long. I said, "You all right, miss? You been out here long?" She did not answer immediately. She looked at me, and then she looked past me at my truck, and then she looked back at me, and her expression shifted in a way that I have replayed in my memory 1,000 times without being able to categorize it precisely. It was not relief. It was not gratitude. It was assessment. The same quick, calculating, evaluative look that a poker player gives their hand before deciding how much to bet. "My tire blew," she said. Her voice was steady. Too steady, I thought, for someone who had been standing alone on a dark highway in the middle of the Nevada desert at 1 in the morning. "I do not have a spare. My phone is dead. I have been here for over an hour, and you are the first person who has stopped." I looked at the tire. I looked at her car. I looked at the back seat, which was empty except for a gym bag and a jacket. I said, "I can call a tow truck on my CB radio. Nearest town is probably Imlay or Mill City, maybe 45 minutes out, "You are welcome to sit in my cab where it is warm while we wait." She nodded. She smiled. It was a normal smile, the kind of smile that a frightened young woman produces for a stranger who is offering help, and there was nothing wrong with it, nothing I could identify at the time. But in the years since that night, I have examined that smile in my memory, the way a forensic analyst examines a piece of evidence under magnification, and what I have concluded is that it was too composed. It was the smile of a person who is performing an emotion rather than experiencing one, the way an actor smiles on stage, convincing from the third row but hollow from up close. We walked to the truck. She climbed into the passenger seat, and I climbed into the driver's seat, and I turned up the heater and handed her a bottle of water from the cooler behind my seat. She took it and drank, and set it in the cup holder, and folded her hands in her lap, and looked at the dashboard with the quiet, observant attention of someone memorizing a room. I picked up the CB handset and hailed Channel 19. No response. I tried Channel 9, the emergency channel. Static. This was not unusual for that stretch of highway, where the terrain and the distance from repeater towers combined to create dead zones that could swallow a transmission entirely. I told her I would try again in a few miles, and offered to drive to the next exit where we might get cell service. She nodded. I released the parking brake, checked my mirrors, and pulled back onto the highway. We drove in silence for several miles. The radio was still playing, Johnny Cash now, and the engine rumbled in its steady diesel baritone, and the highway unrolled ahead of us in an infinite corridor of white dashes, and I began to relax, because the situation had resolved itself into something familiar and manageable. A roadside assist, a minor detour, a story to tell at the next truck stop. Then she asked me a question. "Do you always drive alone?" The question was innocent enough. Truckers get asked it all the time. But the way she asked it, the specific emphasis she placed on the word alone, the way she tilted her head slightly to the left as she said it, made something in the back of my brain, the old reptilian part that has been keeping humans alive since before we had language, sit up and pay attention. "Most of the time, yes, ma'am," I said. "It is a solo operation." She nodded slowly. She looked in the side mirror, a long look, 3 or 4 seconds, and then she looked at me and said, "Is there anyone expecting you at the other end? Like, does someone know exactly when you are supposed to arrive?" The reptilian brain was fully awake now. It was sending signals that my conscious mind was trying to dismiss as paranoia, because the alternative, the possibility that I had invited danger into my cab, was too alarming to accept without more evidence. "My dispatcher tracks my GPS," I said, which was true. "They know exactly where I am at all times." She smiled again. That same composed, theatrical smile. "That must be comforting," she said. I drove another 2 miles. The highway was empty. The desert was empty. The world was empty. And then I saw something in my driver's side mirror that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles went white. Headlights. A vehicle behind us, approaching fast, running with no headlights until this moment, and then suddenly turning them on, as though the driver had been following us in the dark and had decided, for reasons I could not fathom, to announce their presence. The vehicle closed the distance quickly, too quickly, and as it drew closer I could see that it was a pickup truck, large, dark, lifted, with a brush guard on the front and no front license plate visible. It pulled into the left lane alongside my cab and matched my speed, and in the glow of my running lights I could see the driver. It was a man. He was looking up at my cab window with the same expression I had seen on the woman's face when my headlights first hit her beside her car. Assessment. Cold, calculating, predatory assessment. He raised his hand and pointed at the shoulder of the road. "Pull over." The woman beside me shifted in her seat, and I heard a sound that crystallized every half-formed suspicion in my mind into a single, absolute, ice-cold certainty, the click of a folding knife being opened. I did not look at her. I did not take my eyes off the road. I adjusted the mirrors with my left hand so I could see her in the convex glass, and what I saw was a young woman sitting in the passenger seat of my truck, holding a folding knife with a 4-inch blade in her right hand, the blade resting against her thigh, pointed toward me, held with the practiced, underhand grip of someone who had been taught how to use it. "Pull over, Ray," she said. She had read my name off the registration card clipped to the sun visor. Her voice was calm, conversational, the voice of a woman ordering coffee, not the voice of a woman pointing a knife at a man in a moving vehicle. "My friend wants to talk to you." I was doing 65 miles per hour. The pickup was in the left lane, matching my speed exactly, close enough that if I swerved, I would clip his front quarter panel. The woman was in my passenger seat with a knife. I had approximately 4 seconds to make a decision, and in those 4 seconds, my brain performed a series of calculations that were not mathematical but instinctual, the product of 22 years behind the wheel and a lifetime of being a large man who has learned to recognize the specific quality of stillness that precedes violence. I did not pull over. I downshifted. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, and the Kenworth surged forward with a roar that shook the cab, and the sudden acceleration pushed the woman backward into her seat, and I saw her hand with the knife jerk sideways as she grabbed for the dashboard. The pickup swerved toward me, and I felt the mirror on the driver's side shatter as his brush guard clipped it, and I kept accelerating. 80,000 pounds of steel and cargo building momentum on a flat, straight highway with nothing ahead and everything behind. And I reached across the cab with my right hand, and I grabbed the woman's wrist, the one holding the knife, and I squeezed. I am not a violent man. I have been in exactly 2 fistfights in my life, both before the age of 20, and I have no desire to harm anyone under any circumstances. But I have spent 22 years gripping a steering wheel and manhandling cargo straps and cranking landing gear, and my hands are not the hands of a man who works at a desk. I squeezed her wrist, and I felt the small bones shift under my fingers, and she gasped, and the knife dropped onto the center console, and I released her wrist and grabbed the knife and threw it behind my seat in a single motion without taking my eyes off the road. She screamed. Not the calculated, controlled performance of the past 30 minutes, but a genuine, ragged, furious scream that filled the cab like shattered glass. She lunged for the steering wheel, and I shoved her back with my forearm, hard, harder than I have ever pushed another person, and she hit the passenger door with her shoulder, and the door handle jabbed into her back, and she went still. In the mirror, the pickup was falling behind. My truck was fully loaded and heavy, but I had momentum now, and the diesel engine was screaming at redline, and the speedometer was climbing past 75, past 80, past 85, speeds that were dangerous and illegal and reckless, and that I maintained without hesitation because the alternative was worse. The pickup tried to keep up for another mile, and then its headlights began to recede, shrinking in the mirror from bright circles to dim points to nothing. And I watched them disappear, and I kept my foot on the floor for another 5 miles before I allowed myself to breathe. The woman was pressed against the passenger door. She was breathing hard, and her face was pale, and she was looking at me with an expression that was no longer composed, no longer theatrical, no longer performing anything. It was the face of a predator whose ambush has failed, stripped of its disguise, raw and furious, and already calculating its next move. I picked up the CB handset with my free hand and hailed Channel 19, and this time, by whatever grace governs radio waves in the high desert of Nevada, someone answered. It was another trucker, eastbound, call sign Rooftop, about 10 miles ahead of me. I told him I had a hostile passenger and a vehicle pursuit, and I needed law enforcement at the nearest available location. His voice came back steady and serious, and without a single unnecessary word. "Copy that, driver. Nevada Highway Patrol has a way station at Winnemucca, mile marker 142. I will relay. Keep rolling." I kept rolling. I drove 30 more miles with a woman in my passenger seat who had tried to rob me or kill me or both, and I drove those miles in a silence so absolute and so charged that the sound of the engine and the tires and the wind seemed to exist in a separate dimension from the two of us, who existed only in the space between the driver's seat and the passenger door, a space approximately 4 feet wide, which is both a very large distance and a very small one, depending on which side of the knife you are on. She did not try anything else. She sat against the door with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and she watched the road ahead with the flat, empty, calculating stare of someone who is already planning the story she will tell when the authorities arrive. I pulled into the Winnemucca Way station at 1:58 in the morning. Two Nevada Highway Patrol cruisers were waiting with their lights on. I stopped the truck. An officer opened the passenger door, and the woman stepped out and immediately began talking, rapid, breathless, tearful, a performance so instantaneous and so convincing that if I had not been the person sitting next to her for the past 45 minutes, I might have believed it myself. She told the officers I had picked her up from the roadside and tried to assault her. She told them I had a knife. She told them she was the victim. She cried. She shook. She pointed at me with a trembling finger that had been rock steady when it was wrapped around a knife handle 20 minutes ago. The officers listened. They separated us. They searched the cab. They found the knife behind the seat. They found her phone in her jacket pocket. And the phone was not dead. It was fully charged, and its recent call history showed a call placed to an unsaved number approximately 90 seconds before I stopped at mile marker 113. A call that lasted 4 seconds, which is precisely long enough to say one coming, or truck stopping, or any other short message that a person might relay to an accomplice waiting in a pickup truck in the dark. They found other things on the phone: photographs of license plates, notes containing CB handles and truck identification numbers, a text thread with the unsaved number that spanned 3 months and contained discussions of routes, timing, cargo values, and disposal methods that the investigating officer later described to me as consistent with an organized criminal operation targeting solo commercial drivers on isolated highway segments. They arrested her at the way station. I sat on the bumper of one of the patrol cruisers and watched them put her in the back of the other one. And as they guided her head under the door frame, she looked at me through the glass with an expression that I will carry with me into whatever comes after this life. It was not anger. It was not defeat. It was disappointment. The same look a chess player gives the board when a game they were winning turns on a single unexpected move. She had lost, and she was already analyzing the loss, cataloging the variables that had produced it, identifying the moment where the plan had deviated from the script. She was learning from me. She was getting better. They put out a bolo on the pickup truck and found it 2 hours later at a rest area east of Battle Mountain, empty, wiped clean, with stolen plates from a vehicle in Elko that the owner had not yet reported missing. They found the driver 4 days later in a motel in Boise, Idaho, a man with 2 prior convictions for armed robbery and an outstanding warrant in California. Under interrogation, the woman, whose real name was not the name she had given me, and whose waitress uniform was a costume purchased from a thrift store, provided information that led to the identification of 4 additional incidents on I-80 and I-93 over the preceding 18 months. 4 other drivers had stopped for a woman on the shoulder. 4 other drivers had let her into their cabs. None of those drivers had driven away. Their trucks had been found at various locations along the highway, emptied of cargo, and the drivers themselves had been found in varying states of distress in the desert, robbed of their personal belongings, their phones, their wallets, and in one case their truck itself, which was recovered 3 states away, with the VIN plates removed and the cargo sold. One of those drivers, a man from Nebraska named Gil Pruitt, who had been hauling frozen food on I-93 south of Wells, was never found. His truck was recovered in a gravel pit outside of Jackpot, with the refrigeration unit still running and his logbook open on the seat and a single smear of blood on the steering wheel that DNA analysis matched to Gil Pruitt and to no one else. His family held a memorial service 8 months later. I attended. I sat in the back row of a church in Grand Island, Nebraska, and I listened to his daughter read a poem she had written about her father, and I did not tell her that the woman who had lured him off the highway had been sitting in my passenger seat 6 months later, alive and well and calculating and patient, performing the same routine with the same costume and the same flat tire and the same desperate wave and the same composed theatrical smile. I did not tell her because I did not know what to say that would not make it worse. What do you say to a 12-year-old girl who has lost her father to a stretch of empty highway and a woman with a flat tire and a smile? What do you say that does not make the world smaller and darker and more frightening than it already is for a child who will spend the rest of her life wondering what her father's last hours looked like and whether he was afraid and whether he called out for help that never came? I sat in that church pew and I listened to her poem and I cried. And I cried not because I am sentimental, but because I understood, with a clarity that felt like a physical wound, that the only difference between me and Gil Pruitt was that I had gotten lucky. I had stopped at the same shoulder. I had opened the same door. I had let the same person into my cab. But somewhere between mile marker 113 and the Winnemucca way station, some combination of instinct and suspicion and the sheer dumb fortune of having a CB radio that found a signal when I needed it had kept me alive, and that combination had not been available to Gil. And that was not justice, and it was not fairness, and it was not any kind of cosmic order. It was chance, pure, arbitrary, indifferent chance. My wife asked me once, about 6 months after the incident, after I had woken her up for the third time that week by shouting in my sleep whether I regretted being a truck driver. I told her no. I told her that trucking had given us a house and health insurance and a retirement account and the ability to send our son to a school with a science lab and a football field. I told her that I loved the road, that I had always loved the road, that the road was the only place I had ever felt completely free. And then I told her that freedom and fear are not opposites, that they can occupy the same space at the same time, and that the road I loved had shown me something about itself that I could not unsee, the way a house you have lived in for 30 years reveals a room you never knew existed, and the room contains something you wish you had never found. I have been asked many times why I stopped that night. I have been asked by police officers and insurance adjusters and trucking company safety directors and my wife and my brother and my therapist, who I began seeing 3 months after the incident and who I continue to see every 2 weeks because the nightmares have not stopped and I do not believe they ever will. I stopped because I saw a woman alone on a dark road and I thought she needed help. That is the whole of it. That is the entire explanation. 22 years of driving and 47 trips around the earth, and I still could not distinguish a person in genuine distress from a person performing distress because the performance was perfect and the stage was dark and the audience, which was me, wanted to believe that the world contained more people who needed help than people who used the appearance of needing help as a weapon. I drive days now. I requested the schedule change and my company granted it without argument because they had read the police report and they understood. I drive in daylight on busy highways and I stop only at well-lit facilities with security cameras and other drivers, and I never, ever, under any circumstances, pull onto the shoulder for a vehicle I do not recognize. When I see a car on the side of the road with its hazards on, I call it in on the CB or on my cell phone and I keep driving. And I do not look in the mirror to see if someone is waving, because I know what that wave looks like now. I know how convincing it is. I know how it feels to be the kind of person who stops, and I know how it feels to be the kind of person who does not stop. And I have chosen the second one because the first one nearly killed me. There is a mile marker on I-80 in Nevada, mile marker 113, on a flat stretch of highway in the Humboldt Sink, where the sagebrush runs to the horizon, and the stars are so thick you could reach up and close your hand around a fistful of them. I pass it sometimes on my daytime runs, and every single time I pass it I look at the shoulder, and the shoulder is empty, and the road is empty, and the desert is empty, and I accelerate past it at the legal speed limit, and I do not slow down, and I do not stop, and I do not look back, because I know that somewhere out there, on some other stretch of empty highway in some other state, there is another car on another shoulder with another flat tire and another woman standing beside it with her arms wrapped around herself, shivering in the cold, waiting for the next pair of headlights to appear on the horizon. And I know that when those headlights come, she will wave, and the driver will see her face in the glare, pale and frightened and alone. And the driver will think the same thing I thought, the thing that every decent person thinks when they see someone in trouble on a dark road in the middle of nowhere. I should stop, and some of them will, and some of them should not have.